Justin Hast, welcome to the show.
Hey Joe, thank you very much for having me. We've almost been blindsided by everything that could possibly happen to prevent us from chatting before the new year, but here we are. So thank you so much for having me.
It's a pleasure. It's a pleasure. Where there's a will, there's a way, and I think there was a will on both sides. So, how was your Christmas?
Joe, well, yeah, very very good. It sort of it came, I guess, out of the blue a little bit this year. It was one of those that crept up really quick, and it was nice. I've got a couple of days down in Dorset with my in-laws just to reflect on the year, which is it's one of my favourite times of the year, actually, just for so many reasons. But it's one of my favourite times just to gather the thoughts and have a think about how things went, and also to be excited about what's to come. Not laying down too many goals or anything, but just a nice opportunity to reflect. So no, Christmas was great and very relaxing. So I'm fired up for the year to come.
What the listeners don't know, because this was obviously not recorded in the middle of December, is that Justin bought me a very lovely ICW Big Pilot for my Christmas. Isn't that right, Justin?
I did. It was a Ceratanium pilot's watch, Doppel chronograph from Schaffhausen, and it was my sincere thanks to you for the opportunity to be on the pod.
Terrific. So, at first glance, Justin, at your broad shoulders and chiseled jaw, I think more open side flanker on a rugby team rather than timepiece connoisseur. You've got quite a niche interest.
Yeah, no. Well, Jesus, Joe, what do I owe you for that compliment? Hope to God the wife heard that in the background, because I certainly don't hear that sort of compliment very often. No, it's you know what? It's funny because when we spoke originally, I was very excited about being on the pod because for me, sport has always been, alongside watches, has always been my two passions. And growing up, I played rugby and cricket, and both of them kept me sane in different ways. And since then, almost anything and everything I could pick up and have a crack at, I would. And really, my dream growing up was to play professional rugby, and I think a combination of injury and quite honestly not having the edge that edge that I needed to push to the final stage. But certainly that was my dream growing up, and I was single minded about it. And so sport and watches together, one more of a niche than the other, but again they sort of balance each other off in my life, because if I'm not watching one or playing or participating in one, then I'm certainly trying to learn or share or do something in the other.
What I really find interesting is that you can't fake passion or interest in things. Because I was thinking about this recently. If you're not interested in a book or a topic of a book and it's quite dense, you just can't really force yourself through. Whereas when you're like hooked by something, you just consume it. And when you're talking to someone who's hooked by something, their eyes light up. And when it comes to watches and sport, your eyes, you just see, they just light up. What was it that led up to this just love of watches?
Yeah. Do you know what, Joe? I haven't thought about it for a while, actually. I think it was a combination of things. Well, I never met my grandparents on either side. I'm South African originally, and both I never met either set of grandparents. For my birthday, for my 21st, like most watch geeks out there, you'll find, and I'm sure there's a few listening, and they'll be able to relate, is that there's this moment where you have a loved one that hands you a watch, or wears a watch, or shares a story about a watch that then captures your imagination. And for me, it came from my dad, and my grandfather on his side, my paternal grandfather, was only a one watch guy, as they say, and he wasn't a man of great means by any stretch of the imagination. He just he saved up for one Omega and he bought it and wore it all his life. So when I look down at that object, that's what it represents to me. And for a lot of people out there who aren't necessarily as passionate as I am about the subject, they may be mistaken for thinking that it's all about cost or value or resale value or status. And of course, those are elements of the reason why we love watches, but they're not the primary one for me. And it's all about people, and it's all about stories, and it's about emotion.
You mentioned there the status side of watches, and a lot of brands bring out quite opulent models, which are then flaunted around as a signal of wealth. Is that just par for the course when it comes to watches, or does that kind of go against the grain of what you really think watches are about?
To me personally, John, I don't mean I don't want to preach my own views. It's not a religious thing, so I don't want others to necessarily feel they have to go down the same track as me. But certainly, those that I am connected to in the community, the watch collecting community, and the media, I would suggest that the primary driver is the passion for the engineering, the passion for the design, the passion for the history, the passion for the technical development, the materials development, the brand side of things. I find the brand building side of things fascinating. I mean, you only need to look at Rolex and Patek to appreciate that these are multi-billion-dollar businesses that have been able to craft, for lack of a better term, unbelievable brands around what they make. So, I can see why watches are for some people just an opportunity to show that they've made it, or that they've done something that makes them feel that they should be able to sort of share that, celebrate that with people every day. It's not necessarily why I'm in it, but equally, it's whatever brings people to watches to me is a great thing. And many years ago we had the Apple Watch that came out, and people were very fearful in the mechanical watch world that that would wipe out the business. But in truth, all it's done is put more watches on more wrists. And so if people are going to go and buy watches for whatever reason, and wear them, and that's the key thing here, is wearing them, because you want to wear them, you don't want to leave them in a safe and just feel like you can't interact with them. If they're going to do that, then that's brilliant, and so I'm happy with that.
It's funny what you're saying about Apple Watches there. We had Tom Chamberlain on the show, and I said, why would you buy a mechanical watch these days when you can buy an Apple Watch which tells your heart rate and your email, etc.? And he says, well, first of all, people don't buy mechanical watches to know the heart rate. And he asked me if I had an Apple Watch, and I said yes. And then he asked how many times I've had to replace it. And I've had to replace it twice. And he says, okay, so you've had to replace it twice. In a couple more years, you'll have to replace it again. And suddenly, that mechanical watch, which was a few £1,000s, you're already there, and that mechanical watch is gonna keep going for another 50 odd years without any extra attention. Whereas your Apple Watch, you're just gonna have to bin it in a few years. And I thought, oh my goodness, that's actually such a good point, which many people don't realize.
Yeah, I think it really speaks to our generation coming through, who want things that are going to last, and there are very few things in our lives now that really do last. It's also, a friend of mine commented the other day that, in fact, what it is, it's the ultimate luxury, because anything that can be worked on, manipulated, or serviced, to me, is the ultimate luxury. And 50 years is just a start point. I mean, I do get to handle watches that are, yeah, 50, 60, 70, 80, even 100 years old. And that's incredible. And we're already very much starting the journey, because if we think back to, okay, pocket watches were well before this, but the first wristwatches only came into our lives about 100 years ago, give or take. And so we're still very much at the journey of the wristwatch as such, but it's a magical thing. And as I say, there are just so few. There are so few other things in our lives these days that aren't disposable, and tech, at least to me, it is. It's replaceable. It's updatable, and it needs to be, changed every few years, which is not ideal. But the other thing, of course, is that funnily enough, I do wear a Whoop on my one wrist, and I wear a mechanical watch on the other. Or, well, it's not mechanical actually today, but I do wear a Whoop on the other. So I like to be plugged into data, particularly around performance, training performance and health performance. But to me, it doesn't necessarily need to be in the watch, and it doesn't need to tell me my email. And I don't want to be called. That's for sure. I don't want to take calls on my wrist. That's for sure.
You've kind of carved out a really nice area for yourself in the industry where you speak and represent a lot of different brands, go to different events, but you also do a lot of your own writing and presenting. How did that come about? Because you've been at this game for about a decade, but you're no old man at that rate.
Yeah, no, thanks, Joe. That's very kind, boy. Thank you. No, it's one of those things that, as you say, if you find something that you're passionate about, it tends to spiral, and you can't foresee what the future holds. A bit like old Steve Jobs, the late Steve Jobs said in his commencement speech at Stanford, you can't connect the dots looking forward. You can only connect them looking back. And I think, in truth, I started with that Omega from my grandfather, and that then inspired me to do the research, and then that inspired me to maybe pick up a camera. And I certainly wasn't trained to shoot anything, to take photos or film anything, but it's something that you develop over time. And those brands or those watches you dreamt of owning, or dreamt of working with, suddenly they become reality when you have that sort of resilience to continue to push forwards, continue to, of course, there are times when the door gets closed on you, and you feel like you're not welcome, and that you're not you're not this and you're not that, you're not knowledgeable enough, it can be a subject that's quite intimidating because it's quite a detail orientated subject. You need context to create a picture around what you're saying. To write about them, you need to sort of, it's not something you can necessarily just start writing about and feel like you've got some depth of context around. So yeah, it's been 10 years plus, and I feel very very fortunate, genuinely very very fortunate. I wake up every morning. My Sunday nights, I'm ravenous for the week to come. I'm excited about what the potential inbox might have on Monday morning. And for me, I think I'm probably a little bit dyslexic and ADHD as well, where I need lots of different things coming in. And a bit like you hosting a pod, you never know what the next guest is going to be like. You never know what the subject's going to be like. You never know how you're going to approach it. And and so it could be photography, it might be film, it might be presenting, it might be hosting an evening with collectors. All of that is super cool to me, and it revolves around that one subject which I love. So I feel very very fortunate.
If we're to dive in now into the
Mhm.
watch chat for the audience, say they are approaching their first watch, they would like to invest in a lovely timepiece. What sort of things would you recommend for people to be looking out?
Well, I think number one, and I do this frequently with friends who've not bought a watch before or had any interest, and they're like, "Dude, you've got a job talking about watches, shooting watches. What is that a real job? Is that what is that?" But it's so much fun because what you do often is you get a chance to see through the eyes of someone who's not been impacted or influenced by anything else other than just their passion and their heart. And I think one of the great things to do, and my advice I guess would be to look out there and see which brands speak to you, see which designs speak to you, because ultimately you're the one that's got to wear it. And what I would say is, once you buy your first, it likely won't be your last, and you want to keep that first watch. So go with your heart. Go with your heart. Of course, have an eye on your wallet, but don't let the wallet dictate everything. I'm not a financial advisor by any stretch of the imagination, and shouldn't be because I'm terrible with money. But let the heart go. And if you find a design, for example, the best value for money out there, and we have to decide whether you're going to be buying a mechanical watch to start with or a quartz watch. One being powered by your movement, the rotor on the watch powering the movement, or the other, which is a battery. And those are the fundamentally two different elements. The mechanical will be more expensive typically. Um, and then you have to decide if you're going to go through the hand wound approach, where there's no rotor that winds the movement, or the rotor. So you've got an automatic caliber or you've got a hand wound caliber. And when it comes to mechanical watches, the best value for money right now, I just off the top of my head, for anybody listening who might be open to buying a watch that's approachable price point wise, we're still talking 1,000, 1,500, 2,000, 2,500, £3,000, but that's kind of where you're at for entry level mechanical watches, unless you're at the Timex price point, or below, which might be under £1,000, or another independent watchmaker like Baltic. But I think of Tudor. Tudor are the Rolex sister company. They're readily available these days. Some watches from a lot of brands are not readily available. You can go in and buy one, and I think that's the cool thing about it. You get all of the manufacturing quality of Rolex and the build quality in a package that might set you back 2.5 grand for a Tudor Pelagos or a Tudor Black Bay. Now that's a traditional sort of dive watch, sports watch. You can change the straps on it. It can be personal to you, and that's the sort of watch I think of when I think of a great quality entry level watch. If you like dress watches, there's a German company called Nomos, who are at a similar price point. If you like simple Bauhaus design, they offer amazing quality. They design a lot of their own movements in house. They build them in house, and they're a wonderful option at that price point. But as I say, you've got to go in there. My advice is go and try watches on. Go into the stores, try watches on, and see what speaks to you. You might find that the Reverso, a very unusual rectangular case that flips over on itself from Jaeger LeCoultre, speaks to you because you just love it. Or the off-center, the asymmetric dial from A. Lange& Söhne and the Lange 1. Okay, it's going to cost you a fair whack more than what we've just discussed, into the tens of thousands. But whatever it is, whatever your budget is, and whatever your heart says, those are the key factors for my advice there, Joe. Sorry, I could probably go on for hours on this.
This is great. This is great. So I've got on me now a Tudor Black Bay Heritage, which was
Oh, there
given
you
to me
go.
for my
Fantastic. I didn't
21st
know
birthday.
that. I didn't know that.
So we're in sync already.
Mhm.
There's a urban myth that Tudor is just a cheap Rolex. Is that correct?
No, I think for me, it's actually far cooler. Honestly, they get the chance to do things that Rolex don't or can't. They partner with the All Blacks. They partner with explorers. They partner with Lady Gaga. They partner with really unusual individuals, people, teams. They do cool things. The product is more youthful. It doesn't take itself too seriously, but it's very serious in the sense that it's engineered in the same way. And I just prefer the designs, to be honest with you, because you can find something that's a little bit different. So no, it's absolutely not.
How do you then explain the difference between the two if a lot of their workings are the same, but they're often, half the price?
Mm. Well, it's just a very commercial approach. The Tudor was always developed by Hans Wilsdorf, the founder of Rolex, as an offer that would be more approachable price point wise. To start with, we look at the complication. Typically, they're time only watches. There isn't there are chronographs like the one you're wearing, a Black Bay chronograph, yeah. But beyond chronographs, there aren't any significant complications there. If we look at the finishing of things like bracelets and cases, there is an argument to suggest that Rolex, that there's a little bit more time spent on the finishing, which is often where the cost in a watch comes from. People ask why a watch costs a certain amount, particularly at the high end, and it's typically because of the finishing. But primarily, this is about sort of supply and demand. The Rolex brand in itself just has a level of supply and demand that is entirely different to any other brand in the world, and they are masters of supply and demand. And the product it could almost be anything, and people will still be wanting that Submariner. They'll still be wanting that Daytona, and yeah, and it's just different to any other brand. So that's why Tudor can't command the pricing that Rolex does, and likely never will, because that's not the market that it's looking for. I've got an old Tudor. I've got an original Tudor Snowflake from the 70s, a 7016, which was the same watch that was issued originally to the French divers, the Special Forces divers. And it's one of my absolute favorites. It's full of character. The old Tudor models had Rolex casebacks with a crown, or a crown, literally a Rolex crown, or there was elements of crossover in the production in the early years. And it's fascinating. And this is this is, I guess, the start of the geekiness of the watch world, is that there are many collectors around the world that specialize just in vintage Tudor or just in Rolex dive watches. And the minutiae, the detail around the minutiae is just insane. And Rolex don't corroborate anything really. They don't provide you insights into anything about whether this was the right bezel used at that particular time from them. It's just a minefield, and so it's really interesting, really fascinating, and it takes a lot of time to feel that you're scratching the surface.
You mentioned they're divers watches, and there's also when someone goes to buy a watch or wants to go and try them on, there'll be categories from the traditional point of view. So there'll be divers watches and pilot watches. If we take divers watches first, what key features would divers watch have, and why would it be used in such a way?
Yeah, no, it's really interesting, and often when you're a collector or enthusiast, you're thinking, what's my pilot's watch, what's my dive watch, what's my dress watch? It's so for a dive watch, there are certain parameters that have to be met for it to effectively be called a tool watch, a dive watch, for functional use. That is, let's be clear that most people don't use dive watches these days for diving. You call them desk divers just because people spend their time at the desk rather than actually going to the depths of the ocean. But what you look for are the design features, which are also functional. So you've got a rotating bezel, often rotating in a single direction, because you don't want it to. The early models used to be bidirectional, but now it's just unidirectional, and that's because when you're diving, you don't want to hit the bezel, because obviously your dive time is your secondary time is determined by where that bezel is. So if you want 10 minutes or 20 minutes or 30 minutes of dive time, that's where you rotate your bezel to, and so you can see where the hour, the minutes come to on the dial to then tell you that your time has come to an end of your gas, your dive time. So you're looking for the bezel, and that's often bold, easy to use, easy to manipulate. We think of models like the 50 Fathoms from Blancpain. You're thinking of the Tudor Black Bay. You're thinking of the Rolex Submariner. You're thinking of the IWC Ingenieur. You're thinking of the Ocean 2000 from IWC. Those are the types of design. The initial design impact is through the bezel. Then you're looking at the dial, and often there's loomed material, so something that can glow bright in dark conditions and underwater. That used to be tritium, and that got discontinued a few years ago, and it's now been replaced by superluminova, which is a very modern, very bright substance, which is often applied to the hands, because you need to recognize the hands, you need to recognize the markers. And then beyond that, you can look at things like the case itself, and the crown. And crucially, you need a screw down crown, because you do not want water to go into the watch through the crown. And Rolex developed this oyster case and a screw down crown very early for their watches, actually trialed and tested by a woman very early on, who swam the channel wearing one of the watches, and it survived. And so you need a screw down crown, you need a legible, simple dial that's very bright in different conditions, dark conditions, and then you need a bezel to time your dive. Those are the key factors for a dive watch.
And then if we were to look at a pilot's watch, what would be going on there?
Yeah, very similar in many ways. Legibility is absolutely key in a pilot's watch. Typically, and we look at IWC, you see the use of materials like ceramic, for example. IWC were the first to create a ceramic pilot's watch from 1994 in the 3705 model. That's not a necessity for pilots, but it was part of it's part of people's psyche around the design. A soft iron inner cage, to protect it from magnetism. The watches that were commissioned by the Ministry of Defence, and a number of different watch brands submitted models to this, including IWC, Jaeger, and others. And they all had a cage around the movement to protect it from magnetism, which is important to ensure quality of reading. Again, legibility, because you want to as a pilot, you need to be able to glance at it very quickly and get a gauge of where you're at. Very much echoing the design of some of the tools on the dash of a plane. Simple, legible, functional, robust. Again, with some luminova potentially on the hands or on the dial. And then if you're looking at Breitling, for example, who came up with the Navitime, or one of the early pilots' watches, they have what's called the slide rule on there from the bezel perspective, so you can determine distance traveled and other things. So those are the key criteria for a pilot's watch, I would say.
So now they've gone into the store, they've tried them on, they know the key differences between a diver's watch and a pilot's watch, mechanical and quartz and all that. So they buy their first watch, and then they like it so much that they then think that they're going to buy their other half a watch for a special occasion, perhaps a promotion, birth of a child, birthday potentially. What advice, if any, would you have for buying a watch for a spouse, say a female spouse?
The female spouse, yeah. Well, the thing is, Joe, I think the first thing to note is that, like lots of industries, and for the better, for sure, there isn't really a definitive male and female category anymore. It's very much determined based on your own personal taste. I love seeing a woman with a larger case size and a watch that's a little bit oversized. Vintage Rolex, vintage Patek, vintage Vacheron, sports watches. I think they look great on women. And if women feel that they've got the wrist size and the style to be able to pull it off, then absolutely they should be doing that. And likewise, men have been going for smaller case sizes recently in the last 2-3 years. That's certainly a trend we've seen. So my advice is probably that you want to go out with them and just gauge what they like. Again, they may wear a watch already, and you could have a very good idea of the sort of style and aesthetic that they already like. Because if they already wear a watch, then that's a hugely positive indicator that that's a shape that speaks to them. I would also then sort of consider brand, because we're all conscious of the brand that we associate with, and each of these brands have their own heritage, their own DNA, their own design, and that's cool. So I would suggest that there's a bit of time to be spent on establishing what brand it might be that they want next, and it may be a rung up on the brand that they're probably already wearing, which can end up costing you some money. So it's an interesting process. If it were me, and let's be clear, each and every partner is different as well, I personally would want to get some insight as to what the hell she might want and might actually wear. She does wear an IWC Portuguesa, which is a 40 millimeter chronograph watch in steel, and it's a bit big. It's a bit bigger than what you would traditionally expect a woman to wear, but she loves it. Absolutely loves the watch. I get to wear it as well because it's a size that I like. And so my final bit of advice would probably be to get a watch that you can both enjoy and both have fun with, and that's the key, I think.
You mentioned sports watches. So to someone who's not in the know, when you
Mm.
say sports watch, they presume you don't mean Garmin's or Sunto watches.
No, 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 no. So in the 70s, there was a designer called Gerald Genta, who's probably the most famed designer in the watch world, and he created many, many hundreds of different watches, but a few of them became very famous. And what we saw in the 70s was a really challenging time for the watch world because the quartz had just been developed. There was some currency fluctuations around the world, and the mechanical watch itself was under threat of actually not continuing to be something that anyone wanted. But then a couple of brands used this design or a design or two from Gerogenta, namely Patek Philippe, namely Audemars Piguet, and IWC, who took on sports watch designs. So we say sports watch, we talk about a steel bracelet. They were steel at the time, steel case, fairly chunky, often fairly chunky, again with luminova on the dial, often with a movement that would be suitable for activity, where you've got shock absorbers and other things in the caliber, or more consideration for robustness around the movement. We're not seeing ultra thin calibers or anything like that. We're seeing movements that have some heft to them, that are designed to take impact or to be thrown around and worn in a sporting environment. So that's what we refer to when we talk about sports watches. The classics that we still have in production today are things like the Royal Oak, the Nautilus, the Angenoux, the Vacheron 222, which was launched last year in yellow gold by Vacheron, 37 millimeter case size, so slightly smaller than the traditional 40 or 40, 38, 39, 40 millimeters that you might see now. So yeah, don't be confused when you hear the word sports watch and think that it's a digital watch, because it's absolutely not. But very much one of the most popular segments of the market, and almost every brand out there is developing or has developed their own version of a sports watch.
Talking about brands, if we talk about Richard Mille, for example, they seem
Mm-hmm.
quite a new brand from the outside. It seems like they've spent a bunch on marketing and then they have very expensive watches. From
Yes.
the inside the industry, what's your sort of take on that brand?
From a design perspective, they certainly cornered and owned the Torno shape. That Torno shape that they've created is identifiable. And when we talk about design in the watch world, one of the great challenges is creating a design that is instantly recognizable across the room, or across the tennis court, or across the tee box at the golf, or across the sprint track, where Richard Mille have dominated. Let's be clear, they've had world records broken with watches on the wrists of some of their sprinters. They've had majors won with guys like Bubba Watson wearing a watch. We've had Rafa Nadal winning majors with a Richard Mille on the wrist. So that in itself is kind of wild. I still can't to this day understand how Richard, although he's a very charismatic man, he convinced these athletes to wear these watches, because I appreciate the margins involved at the very top end of the sports performance world. So I still can't understand how they've done that. But, the price point is, as I understand it, at least, was originally actually an error. He wasn't selling watches very prevalently to start with. He then went to a trade show and he actually made a mistake apparently on the pricing and added another zero. And then suddenly people started buying the watches because we touched on the idea of status earlier, and the truth of it is that to know that you're walking around with a very expensive watch, we're talking hundreds of thousands of pounds here. For some people out there, and I understand it. Don't get me wrong. If you walk into a restaurant wearing one, if you walk into a nightclub, if you walk into a meeting, uh, and people appreciate what that is, they may not say anything to you about it, but there's certainly an emotional internal response to that. I've been to the manufacturer where I've been to the Richard Mille manufacturer. There's a few different locations they use. I think their innovation around materials for their cases is outstanding. I think the design is incredible. He himself is actually a lovely, lovely man. He's a collector of vintage cars, and I think he was a racing driver of some kind. I've been to the manufacturing facility because the facility for manufacturing some of the calibers is not in house. So some people find that if you're a brand that makes everything under one roof, then you have some added value. But they're not necessarily pretentious. If you've got the money and you like the design, then they're very cool. But the calibers aren't all made in house. That's just a point to make.
Potentially on the other end of the spectrum, we have the British brand Braymond. So for
Mm-hmm.
me, you talk about being captured by a brand. I've been very captured by Braymond. I love the British, love the designs and the people with whom they partner. But they
Yep.
don't seem in the same category as, an AP, ICW, or even Richard Mille. And there's some controversy around them as well. What's your take on Braymond as a brand?
Immediately, very, very nice guys. The founders are wonderful men who have an ambition to bring watchmaking back to the UK. Let's not forget the UK was the heart and soul of the watch world, even before the Swiss and the Germans came along. And we've got guys like George Daniels and Roger Smith who have been making and make some of the finest handmade watches ever made. Bremont is not that because they are not interested in fine watchmaking in the traditional sense. They are not spending a lot of time on finishing or artistic crafts. What they are is they are a robust tool watch, sports watch manufacturing company who want to produce watches at scale. And that's what they've recently achieved with their new Henley location, where they want to produce lots of watches that can be reliable and for a price point that's approachable. If you like the ambassadors they partner with, if you like the sports, if you like the sporty action, all action element, and that speaks to you, then that's great. I think you look at the Martin Baker model that they produced in partnership with Martin Baker, the ejector seat company. That's a really cool watch, and yeah, super cool watch. So the brand isn't for everybody, and they've recently had a new CEO come in who's come from Tudor, so he will bring a wealth of experience to their business. And they've had investment come in from a very significant investor from America who will expect returns fairly soon. So all of these things are adding intensity to their business right now. I like them a lot. I've never actually bought one or owned one, but I do like them a lot.
Do you see that as a necessary evil that, the big investors coming in who will want return on investment? Do you see that as sort of diluting the pure passion of watchmaking, or is it just part of the course and a necessary evil?
Well, we've seen a consolidation in the industry. So a lot of the brands are owned by big groups. So there's three or four big groups. There's Richemont Group that own IWC, Panerai, Jaeger, Lange & Söhne, Van Cleef and Arpels, Cartier. Then you've got LVMH, who own Bulgari and Tag Heuer, among others. And then you've got, Kering Group did own Juro Pirigo and Ulysses Nadan. They've recently sold them. And then you've got Swatch, of course. You've got Swatch, which is Breguet, Omega, and Swatch. So there's a few big brands that own a lot of the brands, big groups that own a lot of the brands. Um, uh, I think money coming into the industry is expected. It's only become more and more popular the last couple of years. The industry interest in watches in the industry has skyrocketed. Yeah, if you can do it right and you build it right from a brand perspective, you start to benefit from your heritage coming through over the years, and then you've got a story to tell. And let's not forget that the industry is built on storytelling, and thankfully that's what I love, and that's what the industry needs as the lifeblood is storytelling. So yeah, I think it's only natural for capital to come in as a result.
And if we then turn to you, you put out a lot of advice and it's great online. Bezel size. Do you have a preference when it comes to it? Do you sort of steer away from certain bezel sizes?
So proportions, yeah. I love the fact you put out a lot of advice. I hope I put out a lot of advice that's maybe, well, in fact, I hope I don't put out too much advice. I hope I put out my point of view, and if you agree with it or not, please let me know in the comment section below. No, I think that's the fun part, is that it's all about personal preference, and we all like different things. And so certain brands have spoken to me over the years. I have a particular love of IWC, of Vacheron Constantin, the oldest watchmaker in the world, A. Lange& Söhne, a German brand, Laurent Ferrier, Ressence, independent watchmaking, of which we've seen the real rise in the last few years of independent watchmaking coming through. But case sizes, I'm not fussed about case sizes. It just has to be relative to the design itself. If the design was such that they were big case sizes, like the Big Pilot is a 46mm watch, I'm happy for it to be 46mm. I've got a very small Patek Philippe Ellipse, which is a small Tourneau shaped watch that's very delicate and elegant. I'm happy for that to be small, and I feel like I have the confidence to enjoy them, whatever the size of the watch is. But you're right; it's a big subject. It's a subject that people have been questioning. That every day there's a question about case sizing. My advice and thoughts to anybody out there, here we go, providing more advice for people, is to go with what you're comfortable with. So go with what you're comfortable with, what you feel physically comfortable with, and what says something about you to yourself.
It could be quite a basic question, you could say, but when it comes to personal watches and buying watches, on a wrist do you actually wear your watch? Because most comfortably for me is above the wrist bone, but a lot of people will wear it down below the wrist bone so then everyone can see the watch in which they wear. But I find that terribly uncomfy. What's your bit of advice when it comes to this?
What I would say again is just whatever you feel comfortable with. I mean, people do talk about the idea of where it should sit on your wrist. I like to have it sitting maybe just below upper arm. I don't like it very low on the wrist. I like it a little bit further up the arm. I'd suggest, but again, it's very much a personal thing. Very much a personal thing.
You founded the Watch Annual, which must be one of the most aesthetic collection of papers that I've ever seen. Could you just tell us a bit about the Watch Annual?
Yeah, the Watch Annual started 4 years ago now. This is our fourth edition, 2023, and it was a project that I started with a friend of mine in lockdown. Actually, we just thought it would be fun to bring together all of the great imagery from the internet, from Instagram particularly, which has become a real hub for collectors and enthusiasts, and just put them on the page and have them on the page. So all of the great watches from that year with the photos from those that are out there loving watches, collecting watches, sharing watches, and their editorial and their views are on the page. And often people, often they don't get that opportunity to share their thoughts in print, which I love. I love print. I love books. I love magazines. And so, yeah, it was just a print project. It was very much a community project. And it is in many ways the community project. It's the community out there's ownership of it because we don't have any advertising. We donate a percentage to charity. So every year we do £2 of each sale goes to a new charity. And we have CEO letters in there. So we get 5 CEOs or more each year to tell us about how their year went in their own words. So it's very much just a reflection of the year, the best of the year in print.
Is it true that you have an Excel spreadsheet of all the watches that you've owned detailing all of their details?
Where the hell have you heard that from? Who's been sharing that? Yeah, it's true. It is true. It is true. Mainly because I like to look back on. I guess I've had the opportunity over the years to buy many really weird and obscure things, and sometimes you have to trade them in for something else. And I just like to look back on what I've had. I like to sort of put dates to them, put some detail around them, so people who, whomever it might be, my daughter or whomever, one day can see all of the watches that have come and gone and what's there at the moment, and just have an idea of what the hell they're actually looking at and why I decided to buy them, whom I bought them from, who I sold it to if I sold them, and I just think it's a little log for life, really, and it does bring me joy, even though the funny part about it is that I'm terrible with numbers, terrible with Excel spreadsheets, terrible with organization of any kind. But the one thing I've been able to do is have an Excel spreadsheet for the watches.
What would you say would be the ideal collection size? Obviously, as an enthusiast as yourself, you'll have potentially a dozen, if not more. But for the
Mm.
average person, say they have a faint interest in watches, what would you recommend the ideal size of your collection being?
Jeez, I mean that's a tough one, Joe. I think ultimately it does depend on your own passion, taste, capacity, financial capacity. I would say we don't need any of them in our lives. We don't need them in our lives, but they bring joy. They bring joy, and as a result, if you have one watch that you wear every day, and I admire those that do, then that is absolutely fantastic, and that's the one watch that they should wear for the rest of their lives. Um, I think 2 watches is perfect because with 2 watches you can have a sports watch and you can have a dress watch, and then I think you're covered from all bases. And if we were to talk about a dress an unusual dress watch, I'm thinking about the Reverso from Jaeger LeCoultre, the watch that was designed for polo players in India originally. That would be an amazing dress watch, I think. And then if you're thinking about a great sports watch, the IWC Engineer that's just launched, those two would be great as a combination. You've got two entirely different looks. You've got two iconic designs. And you've pretty much got all bases covered. Of course, if you find that you love it and you get bitten by the bug, then you're going to say, hey, actually, I want a vintage watch in there as well. I want a dive watch that I can actually go diving with. I want a pilot's watch like the IWC, or the IWC 3705 or 3706 chronograph. So you're gonna start to find that there's going to be a creep on the parameters. But I think 2 watches is the perfect number, to be honest.
And as we come to a close, because there's a crying baby in the background in need of your attention, you talk about pairing your watch with your outfit. Now, that might seem quite a unusual thing to say as a man as masculine as you, but could you just let us into what you mean by that?
Well, I often don't necessarily give it too much thought, other than that you kind of have a watch that I like to wear for a period of time that you might get out of the safe and have for a few weeks. And it's nice to spend time with a watch maybe that you've not spent time with as well, because you fall in love with it again. But when it comes to styling, personally, I do really like the idea of the high and the low vibes. So I like the idea of I pretty much live in a white t-shirt, even though I'm actually I've got a Christmas lunch with some friends, so I'm looking a little bit fancier now than I do normally with a button-down shirt. But normally I like a t-shirt and a jacket or a work jacket or a Filson or something like that. And then you combine that with a dress watch like a Lange one or a Vacheron or a Patek maybe or yeah, this is not a dress watch but an F. Pigeon. So I like the contrast. I like the conflict of design when it comes to wearing Converse and a high-end dress watch, or the opposite. Having fun with a dress that a watch that may not typically be associated with black tie. I don't know. This, for example, which is a controversial quartz watch, an elegant from F. Pigeon, which is a battery-powered watch. Wearing that with a jacket, a double-breasted jacket and a tie. I mean, for me, it's all about fun and it's all about expressing yourself. And there are no rules either, so it's about just having as much fun as possible, because that ends up being conversation, and then that becomes friendship and ultimately more watches. No, it may mean more watches, but that's where I'm at probably when it comes to clothing and design and wearing watches.
Amazing. Justin, you've been an absolute delight. What a manifesto that you've laid out for us all to follow. Thank you very much for your time.
Joe, thank you, boys. Sorry about the background noise. Apologies, guys, but very grateful to have chatted with Joe, and lovely to meet properly. And thank you for listening. If you managed to survive to the end here, then you've got to be celebrated. Guys, go well. Hope to see you in the new year. Thank you very much.